So please help yourself. And if like you get hungry, because we're talking about mountains, and just get up during the talk, Mark won't mind, go over there and grab some goodies. So it is my distinct privilege to welcome my colleague and an inspiration to me, Dr. Mark Aldenderfer. He is truly one of the foremost experts in how humans have lived and, more importantly, have thrived in high mountain settings. His work has been very inspirational, and I'm not the only one. There are loads of us out there that, really look to you as somebody that sort of charted a path for us. So we appreciate that. Dr. Aldenderfer is Distinguished Professor Emeritus at UC Merced, where he was also the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Endowed Chair in Anthropology, and served a stint as the Dean of the School of Social Sciences, Humanities, and Arts. So
that's very sad.
A sucker for admin, yes.
Hey, that was, yeah.
More fun. Over the course of his long career, Dr. Aldenderfer has conducted fieldwork across the Tibetan Plateau, the Himalayas, the Andes, and in other high-altitude mountain landscapes around the world. His research has been supported by major funders like the National Science Foundation, National Geographic, and Wenner-Gren. He has authored and edited numerous books and more than 200 scholarly articles. How do you do that? Like, you've been a dean and you have these. Oh, yeah. No, I think it was just the eye. His work blends archaeology, genetics, and environmental science to understand long-term human adaptation to high-altitude environments, knowledge that offers powerful insights into climate resilience today. And that brings us to tonight's talk, which is called, as you can see on the screen, Mountain Archaeology and Climate Change from the Deep Past to the Present. So welcome, Dr. Aldenderfer. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you, Bonnie. Very fun.
Use the clicker.
Clicker.
Use the clicker. No.
Okay.
No. There's
This clicker.
Yeah.
Technology like I said, AI. Okay. Well, I'm really happy to be here. This is the second time in my life I've been to Oklahoma, and both times are here. And so it's nice to come back to a place that I know and actually fond of. There was a colleague of mine she still is a colleague, but her name is Tina Warner. And if you guys know, any of you know Tina, what a dynamo that woman is. And she was instrumental in a lot of the work that I do. And you'll see a tiny bit of that in this talk tonight. But in any case, I'm happy to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to, speak with you folks, because I love talking about what I do. Professors love to talk, that. That's what we do, mostly. But these are topics that I really care about deeply. And so what I'm going to talk about tonight then is this idea of mountain archaeology and climate change. And I want to be really clear. When I talk about the deep past, I don't want to go too far in the past. That is, it's interesting. It's fun to think about when our ancestors began to move into mountain environments over the course of prehistory. But what I'm really mostly concerned about tonight is thinking about, is there anything we can learn from mountain peoples of the past that might help us understand what's going on with mountain peoples of today? So this is really why I want to qualify the idea of deep past. And so we're only going to go back in this presentation, maybe 8 or 10,000 years. And most of it will actually be much more recent than that, because that's when we can see most effectively things that we would be interested in seeing about how answers from the past can give us insight into the way the future might actually work. So keep that in mind then as we go through this. Okay, so yeah, I love this slide, because what it does is it shows us what mountains are vulnerable to. And so I'm going to be talking mostly about high mountains tonight. And I'm not talking about, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, about little bumpy mountains. I want to talk about really high places on the landscape that, go well beyond, what lowlanders usually live in. But if you look at this image for a moment, you can see all the different things that mountain environments have vulnerabilities of. We're not going to talk about every one of those tonight, because they're not things that we have data on, or they're not important for right now. But the ones that I think are really important for us tonight, at least in terms of the way in which modern peoples are adapting to, or trying to adapt to, climate change, are really the following. So glacial lake outburst floods, you've probably heard about those at some point. Today, it's avalanche and landslide are important. And also degradation of forests and ecosystems are also important. And finally, water scarcity becomes important. So these are the primary challenges in high mountain environments on the planet that people have to deal with in living in those places. And the good news is, at least in some parts of the world, there is some archaeological evidence of the past that talks about what people in similar circumstances did at some point, and then how those things were either overcome or not overcome by the peoples that lived there at those times. Much of the news, though, that we get about these things is really primarily about tragedies, about catastrophes, about the way in which environments have worked in the past. So this is a relatively recent catastrophe that didn't kill anyone, fortunately. This is a glacial lake outburst flood in the Himalayas. And what you're looking at here is a picture of, you can see where we are. I forgot to bring my pointer, but this works, right? Excellent. Yeah, seriously? Well, it doesn't like the, points there. It doesn't point there. That's okay, don't worry about it. So if you take a look at this image, you can see where we are. We're in the margins of the Himalayas right there. And those red places are places that used to be, they're glacial lakes that once existed in this region. And so a glacial lake is formed when a glacier obviously starts melting, and there's a blockage that creates these lakes. They're natural, but they're also created by global warming. And so what happened in this particular case, in this part of Nepal, is that the number 5 and number 4 actually collapsed at some point. You can see all the other ones that are up there as well. And that was the outcome of it. It's really amazing the power of these things. They just wash right down and they come down these valleys. And fortunately, what happened is that no one was killed in this event. And it's truly remarkable that no one died. But that's the outcome. And what happens then is that you see those houses are stranded right there, but they're now, their entire livelihood has been destroyed. So they have to do something. And what they're going to do, it's really unclear for that particular community in the Himalayas. We don't know. This is one that I didn't know much about, but has really become increasingly common across the world. There's things called rain bombs. So it's when you have a precipitation event that rains more than twice or more than the average annual amount of rain, but in 15 or 20 minutes or half hour. Mm-hmm. And so what happens then is it creates the context, as you see here, all across the Himalayas. And this is why I wanted to show you this slide. You can see all the way almost to Afghanistan to, China, these rainbow, and this all happened this year. So these are events that are beginning to happen more and more frequently because of anthropogenic driven climate change. So climate warming is what the big villain here is right now. It's creating context in which meteorological patterns are changing, climate is changing, rainfall patterns change, snowfall patterns change, everything is changing. And the question is, how do people actually deal with this? So we're going to look at the past just a bit to get some idea about, I won't say solutions, but we'll look at some of the ways in which people might have responded to these things and what some of the outcomes were back in the relatively recent past. So let's talk a little bit about mountains. There are all kinds of mountains out there. I am not going to give you a definition of mountains because, you can go to the literature and you can fight about it all you want because people argue about what's a mountain. Well, I don't really, I know they're high and they're abrupt and they're difficult, but, other people have different ideas about how mountains actually, how to define one. I don't care, really. But you can see that if you even take this definition of mountains here, which is pretty interesting, you can see that much of the planet is actually covered in mountains of one kind or another. So we are going to deal with high mountains. That's where I've worked most of my career, in places in Ethiopia and in the Andes, in Tibet, and then now in the Himalayas of Nepal. So these are the things I'm most familiar with, but others of us work in low mountains. Bonnie works in, I would call them high mountains in the Rockies, mostly, No, they're high mountains, but they're people that work in low mountains. So some of the things I will talk about tonight don't really apply to some of those contexts, because when you're up high, things go wonky really quickly in terms of climate and climate change. So we'll focus on that because it's what I do, So anyway, so where are we going tonight? We're going to South America first, then we're going to the Himalayas. And then for those of you who love Europe, we're going to the French Alps. So we're going to bounce into 3 different scenarios of archaeology in the mountains that give us some insights about climate change and human, I won't say adaptations, I'll say human responses and challenges that they faced in the past. So to do this though, to do good mountain archaeology, it's kind of like archaeology anywhere on the planet. It's, it's archaeology, you just think, oh yeah, we dig stuff up. Well, it's really more complicated. If you want to tell stories about the past that actually mean something to people, what you need to do is you need to do the following sorts of things to make sense of that archaeology. So we do a lot of paleoclimate research in mountain archaeology. You have to, because we have to understand what the environment was like in these places. As I say, we do this all over anyway, but it becomes especially important in mountain environments because they're tricky places and we need to know much more about particulars of those mountains themselves and the way in which they're oriented. We'll talk a bit about that later. So paleoclimate research becomes really critical for this. One thing though that we don't do much of in at least my experience, and I think we need to do more of, is historical ecology. So in other words, we all do ecology, that is all of us work in some sense. Yeah, we talk about creating a framework of ecological relationships in a study area. But many of us don't pay much attention to historical records or historical documentation of climates that once existed in these places. Now, granted, these documents don't often go far back, so they're not deep past, but they're deep enough in some circumstances to give us some really interesting clues about the way in which people might have responded to these things. And so, I just finished a paper recently or had it published recently on historical ecology in the Himalayas. And I did one of those, Google searches, and I did a couple Web of Science searches and all that. You would never find the connection of historical and ecology in any of those contexts. They just don't write about it like that. They don't think about it that way. Even though some people talk about history, lots of people talk about ecology, but those 2 things are really important because they give you really different insights that, you get lots from paleoclimate. But historical ecology tells you a little bit more about interrelationships of those climates and then people. So it's kind of fun. And then clearly, we do a lot of interdisciplinary research. I can't do anything that I do without working with other scholars. It's just impossible. I can dig holes in the ground. So what? But if I want to tell a story that means something about the past, I need the attention, which is hard often to get, and the cooperation and the ability to work with other scholars in different fields. And it's not just saying, hey, let's talk about this. It's actually engaging people in a serious way about the way in which they conduct research and how you can both, or all your team, can actually put some kind of questions together about the past where we each inform each other about these things and come up with a story that's, reasonable. It's based on empirical data, but it's a connection of the stories. So without doing these things, it's really important, impossible to do good mountain archaeology, just not going to happen. You need those things. But the danger of doing these things is that one or other of these can really begin to lead you down a path that you don't want to go. And that path is this. We archaeologists often get accused of environmental determinism because we, create a climate scenario. And then we look at an archaeological record and we see something happened after this climate scenario begins to emerge. And many people then rush to a conclusion saying, well, look, what happened is the X happened after Y. Well, okay, it did happen after X or Y, whichever I just said. But the point I'm getting at is that, establishing the causality becomes extremely difficult. And so the problem that we face then is coming up with a way in which we can tell a good story that is not deterministic in some sense, uses these data, but makes it possible to, find out that sometimes it's just not the way things work, even though environment's important. So we don't want to do that in our studies of any archaeology. But in mountain environments, I think it's critical that we try to avoid this at all costs. So before I launch into my case studies, and I do want to have this, we need to understand this caveat. Those of you who worked in mountains, you know how complicated they are. If a mountain range goes like this, right? This direction, whatever that direction is. Another part of the range goes like this. The ecological and climatological data from this one and this one don't necessarily overlap effectively because of differences in orography, slight differences in elevation, solar solar reflectance. It's really hard to generalize in mountain environments. All of those data I just talked about, I need so desperately, like paleoclimate data and historical ecology data. They're hard to generalize across mountain systems because of those extremely sensitive local differences. So, you have to use these data with great caution. And so everything I talk about tonight is always going to be there's going to be a caveat with everything I talk about tonight, because you have to be sensitive to the fact that, well, these data are not entirely, they're not necessarily reliable in that particular context all of the time. So, do with what you will with that, and, we'll see what happens. So trust your data to a point. And then, what was that Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify, about the Soviets back in the 80s. Well, trust and verify your data, because they can be really tricky for you. Especially gets hard when you're in a kind of an environment where people are like conservation organizations are trying to get you to say something about a place, and they want you to do X, and you can't say, well, I can say X about here. I'm not so sure I can say X 25 kilometers from here, literally 25 kilometers from here, because it might not quite be the same. So keep that in mind. So we're going to South America, Tiwanaku. I know what some of the archaeologists in the room are thinking, oh, really, not the Tiwanaku guys. Yeah, well, okay, it's this site, this is a beautiful picture. It's totally fake. I mean, it's been reconstructed, the way this vista has been created. So, it's a beautiful place though. So, but it's an important archaeological case study of what has been often thought of as being a climate collapse model. In other words, Tiwanaku, I'll talk about in a moment, was supposedly created, the collapse of it was created by climate change. Well, it's a little more complicated than that. And the site has been reconstructed in a touristic form, but it's still a remarkable place on the landscape. So if you ever have a chance to go to Bolivia and go to Tiwanaku, I really encourage you to do so. So this is a fun image, because what it shows is Lake Titicaca. Now, we aren't in mountains per se. We're at 3,800 meters of elevation, and both sides of us are surrounded by mountains, which create a whole variety of interesting climatic conditions in that basin. So there we are in that context. And I direct your attention to the green areas. So the site of Tiwanaku is all the way down in the bottom right-hand corner. And so Tiwanaku had colonies toward the Pacific coast. It had colonies toward the tropical forests further to the east. But the green areas are the places in which the primary agricultural productivity of the Tiwanaku polity existed. These are raised fields. There are different kinds of hydraulic creations that Tiwanaku and other peoples made in this region to create really productive landscapes that produced extraordinarily complex and significant amounts of food in these places. So they're really important places on the landscape in terms of supporting the Tiwanaku polity and whatever the polity actually happened to be. So keep that in mind as we go through then what people think was going on at this time with Tiwanaku. So here's our slide again, which, now we're going to talk about what the hazards were around Tiwanaku and the time frame that we're about to be discussing. So you can see here, we've got degradation of forests and environment. We've got drought, and we've got water scarcity. They're not actually the same thing. Water scarcity just means that water isn't available to you, even though it's there in other contexts. You just can't get it. Drought means it's not raining, or it's not snowing, and it's not creating water that we can actually use effectively for whatever the agricultural practices are. Now, some of the other stuff might have happened, but I want to focus our attention on those three items of what's happening in the climate at Tiwanaku times that you'll see in a moment. So I was talking with Victor just now. He said, I'm from Carabaya, which is actually quite near this place on the landscape, which is the Quelccaya ice cap. This is a remarkable place. I mean, you can actually go trek there if you want to. I don't want to, but it's a really hard trek. It's up there and cold, but look at what you're looking at. This is there's a glaciated environment that has this tremendous cap of ice. In some places, 200 meters thick. That's a lot. And what people have been able to do, scientists have been able to drill that Kelkaya ice cap and create a paleoclimate record of the southern hemisphere. And it connects then in some ways to what we know about the northern hemisphere. And you can actually then begin to think about what was it like in one of those little bars that you see right there, because the dark parts are dust or places where the snow isn't snowing. And then the white stuff is where snow actually fell at one point in the past. There's all kinds of cool stuff in there. Some things that are organic materials have been dated out of it, but it's really the climate record you get out of this context that's really remarkable here. So this gives us a way to tell a story about what the climate might have been like around Tiwanaku, which is not all that far away from this particular ice cap. This has become one of these iconic landmarks about climate science in the world, is this ice cap. And so this is what results out of this. So what you see here is that you see down at the bottom, there's a time frame, and we're looking at, you see 600 CE up to, beyond 1400. You see those little abbreviations. So EIP is early intermediate, MH is middle horizon, LIP is late intermediate, and then LH is late horizon. Those are just what archaeologists call these chunks of time. And what you're looking at then in this is a chart of the way in which you can, in those particular timeframes, and what you can do is date the Kelkaya ice cap to just years. I mean, you can really hone it down, not to 200 years, but you can get down to 10, 12, 5 years in some cases in terms of the resolution of this ice cap. So what you're looking at then is basically the variation in the rate of snow deposit on the Kelkaya ice cap at different times over the source of the core. So what do you see? Well, there's a lot of snow in the middle horizon, and there's not a whole lot of snow in the late intermediate period. And there's a lot of variability in it. But the point where we're going with this is that the middle horizon is when Tiwanaku is supposed to have been created as a primary state in the Andes around 600 AD, give or take. So the argument is, yeah, okay, there's variability, but fundamentally, when you look at the chart, it's saying, oh, look, Tiwanaku was created at a time of good. So all those green places that you saw in the landscape in that previous slide were actually then able to be farmed effectively. Even though there was change in the lake level, they were still able to adapt to the change in the lake level effectively so that they were able to maintain productivity. So the middle horizon, MH, looks like a grand time, doesn't it? Well, take a look then at what happens right after 1000 AD. The rate of snow accumulation begins to drop dramatically. And so for the next, 400 years or so, with a few exceptions, the rate of snow accumulation is really minor. It's not very much snow. What is that telling you? Well, precipitation has changed here in some way. So how that then affects the rest of the climate, that's where you have to use the caveats that I talked about before. It's one thing to talk about rates of snowfall. It's another thing to say what happened in this particular part of the basin, but let's just pretend like this is a good way to describe what took place at the time. Lots of snow in the middle horizon, meaning relatively good times, all things being equal. Temperatures are not too bad at this stage. The LIP, not good times at all in terms of that particular parameter. So many archaeologists then began to take a look at this image and go, well, look at that image. It's clear that what happened to Tiwanaku is that because of the decrease in precipitation that is evident by the Kelkaya ice cap and by other proxies that we're able to say, Tiwanaku civilization fell apart. It disappeared. This has been a trope of archaeology for some time where you talk about, as I said earlier, here's an environmental event. It has caused this to happen. Well, did it? It's complicated. It's not just environment. And that's why I said earlier, don't do environmental determinism. We have to think about people in these environments and what their responses were to that particular concept. So was there a Tiwanaku collapse? There was a change. Notice my weasel words here. I'm not, I'm trying to be, I don't want to say there was not a collapse, but collapse is just one of those things that say, oh my God, everything just fell apart. It's all gone. It didn't all go away, but it did change rather dramatically. So I can say this pretty clearly. There was no collapse per se. Tiwanaku as a regional polity, that is a state level organization, didn't keep doing what it was doing, it's 800 AD. It simply wasn't keeping up with the Joneses in one sense. It really, the colonies that it created in other places, they simply vanished. They eventually went away. Tiwanaku as a particular location on the landscape, it was still there, but nothing like it had been before. Well, so why am I talking about this then? If it wasn't because didn't this environment cause this collapse? No, it did something really different. Something that was wholly unexpected until people started looking at different kinds of data other than the archaeology itself. What they found is there's a rather remarkable increase in regional highland increased non-lethal violence. People are, beating the hell out of each other on the altiplano at this point in these mountain environments. And what's really fascinating is when you look at the, we don't have a slide to do that, I'll just go back to that slide right there. There's relatively little obvious conflict during the middle horizon. When you look at the mortuary record, the human remains from these periods in the highlands, there's interpersonal violence, but it's at a relatively low scale. When you look at that LIP period, things really get ugly during the LIP. So work that Jessica does, for instance, this is the kind of data that people hadn't really looked at in a big regional context before. And all of a sudden they kind of went, wait a minute, this is really cool. What's going on here? And so what you're looking at in the highlands, you're looking at things like that. That's a hill fort, basically. It's a pukara. And what's happening then is that these are built all over the landscape. After Tiwanaku loses its control over the region, what's taking place here is that these populations are reorganizing. So think about, instead of a collapse, you're seeing people move away from places that they can no longer sustain in terms of their agricultural productivity, or they're dangerous. And what they're doing is moving to places that are relatively defensible. Tiwanaku was not a polity based on conquest. It was a polity based on expansion, but not taking land away. Whereas what you're looking at here are people that are moving away from troubled areas in terms of the ability to create, agricultural surpluses. They're creating context in which they can defend themselves and other people who want, that same right for themselves to maintain their polities. And so violence increases rather dramatically in the highlands. And what's fascinating is if you look at the lowlands in the same time frame across different cultures there's no big change in the rates of violence down on the coasts. So it's kind of interesting to see then that this was an unanticipated effect of the way in which Tiwanaku was transformed, and people moved away from trouble, basically. And the trouble was they could not maintain the agricultural systems that existed at that time, given the fact that rainfall and given the fact that precipitation was just simply not adequate to maintain the system that they did in fact have. So this was the result of the so-called Tiwanaku collapse. Lots of people getting in trouble with each other and moving away from sources of trouble at the same time. So that's Tiwanaku, South America, and its associated mountain environments. So let's go now to the Nepal and go to a place called the Barwon Valley. The level of archaeological work in the mountain environments in the Himalayas is very, very scant. There's really not very much done. So much of what I'm going to talk about tonight is a little bit indirect about the way in which we know about what took place in a place like the Barwon Valley. But there's enough archaeology that we know about, plus other kinds of records from, wait for it, historical ecology that tell us something about the way in which things happened in a valley like this over time. So let's locate ourselves in terms of the way the world works so you know where we are. So if you look at the map, we're in eastern Nepal. And if you know anything about the mountains of the Himalayas, there's Mount Everest is further up to the north. And as you're going down, you can see all the different other mountains that are there, Makalu and Lhotse. I mean, this is like climber's heaven. Anybody in here climb? No climbers. Okay, that's fine. I work in mountains, but I don't climb them, believe me, it's just too dangerous. So what you're looking at then here is the system, there's a number of national parks now that have been created in Nepal to try to do some environmental conservation. So there's one about, around Sagarmatha, which is around Everest. And the one we're talking about is down in the Barwon Valley itself. And so you can see the conservation area then that we're looking at right there. So here's the scenario of this slide here that happens in terms of mountain environment and climate. So we have pretty clear evidence of degradation of forest and ecosystems, and we have pretty clear evidence of soil erosion and degradation. So in other words, soil is just not what it used to be, kind of thing. So there might well be other things going on there, but these seem to be the big climate factors in this particular valley in the past in this region. So let's go back to this slide then. Let me tell you a little bit about this place. So the Barwon Valley, goes from very low elevations like, I don't know, 1,000 meters up to over 5,000 meters in terms of the elevation gradient. And so what you're looking at here, this is kind of the mid-range of the elevation gradient you're looking at the moment. You can see that it's, a fairly lush environment, looks like it's lush, but as you go further up to the north, what you find, of course, is that, the environment changes rather dramatically. There's less vegetation, it becomes rockier, the soil becomes, thinner. It's just more difficult to sustain human life in a place like that, unless you've got certain kinds of adaptations go along with it. So one of the things, though, that we know about from history, and not so much ecology, but from Buddhist histories of the relatively recent times, is that what you are looking at, and you get to see it because I'm telling you what it is, this is called a bayul. And a bayul is a hidden land. So in Buddhism, Buddhist thought, a bayul is a refuge. It's a place when things are they're crappy where you live. They're just not working out for you. You can find a bayul and you can go live there. Now it takes a special person to see the bayul though, so you need guidance to get into that place. And so historical records talk about the Barwon Valley as being a bayul at some point, undefined when. And so there's a number of bayuls across the Himalayas then that are these hidden refuges. So if you're on the Altiplano, notice I'm mixing my metaphors here. I mean the Tibetan plateau and going down to the slightly lower elevations, so the mountains that you see there, you go beyond them and you're in Tibet. And so these are bayuls across there that were said to be these hidden valleys that became important and, at some point in the past. And so people would go into them in theory and be protected from whatever the dangers were where they were from on the plateau. Well, it's harder to find the archaeology, what's the archaeology of a bayul look like? I mean, it's a really complicated question because, as those of you who worked in mountains know, it's hard to do archaeology in mountains. Finding things is not easy, even when the soil is relatively close to the surface, even when there's no vegetation, it's hard to find things. So that means that, archaeology has been kind of sparse. And so, all right. But what we do know are some things that are quite interesting about the bayul and about this particular region. So this is what you're looking at here is a paper that we did a few years ago. And this is a paper primarily about genetics. Here are the people that live in this particular part of the Himalayas. Where are they from? And that's one of the big questions I've been dealing with over the course of my career is, where do lowlanders come from? And how do they become highlanders? And so this was part of that study then, looking at questions like that. So the point I want to get at here, though, is not so much looking at the archaeology, which is really hardly any of it has been done in the Barwon, sadly, but there's some that I can point to. Most of the work that's been done is you see the small inset there where you see the site of Samzong and a few others. So that's the place where we've gotten data that tell us something about what appears to be the peopling of the Himalayas. And we can go back about 3,500 years or so, give or take, in Nepal, about where we have evidence of that. But when you look at the Barwon, it's really interesting. Doesn't seem to be anybody there early. Now, what's going on here? Why is it even called a bayul? What are the connections that I'm trying to make out here? And where's it all going with climate, which is part of the reason why we're here tonight, is that the Barwon was occupied by Sherpa. Everybody knows who Sherpas are, right? You know, they carry all the stuff that people want to climb Everest need in order to get there. But the Sherpas are not original to Nepal. The Sherpas actually come from eastern Tibet, and they migrated at some point into central Tibet. And at some other point that I'll point out in a minute in a slide, they migrated into these high valleys of Nepal in this particular part of the Himalayas, not where I work, but further to the east. And so according to what the Sherpas say about their histories, this valley was empty. And so they said, well, we can go there. You know, this is great. Okay. And they did go there. But it's fun then to look at this question right here. Let's connect that then to, in this particular case, to temperature. And so this is basically created by the Kelkai ice cap. It's created by the Greenland ice caps. It's created by a whole bunch of other proxies across the northern hemisphere that tell us something about temperature variability over the last, in this particular case, over the last, 1800 years or so, give or take. And you can see these bumps. So don't get hung up on why the green one isn't quite the same as the red one, as the blue one. They're all trying to measure the same thing using slightly different ways to measure temperature in their particular regions. But where do things get really wonky in this image? Wonky in terms of temperature gets really cold. It gets cold in that little ice age time frame. So, and that seems to be a pretty good signal across much of the northern hemisphere. Southern hemisphere, not so much. Northern hemisphere really works out well, but look at the dates then. So things get really critical, and we'll talk about this slide in another image, in another context in a moment. Things are really dramatic in terms of temperature variability in around 1500, 1600 AD, okay? But it's getting colder at that same time. When did the Sherpas show up in the Barwon Valley? 1400. Pretty well documented. The Sherpa, we can say that with some certainty. They're coming just as the little ice age is beginning to kick in. So the question is, why are they there? What are they doing there? What does this have anything to do with climate? And the answer is, I think it really does have a lot to do with climate, because then you begin to look at the historical records on the Tibetan Plateau, and most of the documentary work that's the things that Tibetans wrote about themselves are really about Buddhist stuff. Anybody Buddhist here or interested in Buddhism? No, I didn't think so. It's okay. But they write a lot about saints and a lot about trajectories of lamas and all this kind of stuff. But there's amazing tidbits you can glean from it if you know how to look at the literature that say during the same time frame, just about 1200 to 1400 and beyond, there are two things that took place on the Tibetan Plateau. The first one was some extraordinary mega droughts. So you're familiar with maybe the mega drought that took place in the American Southwest, not terribly far from this time frame. The 1100s roughly into the 1200s, a very serious, 25, 30, 40-year drought where things got really bad. What did people do during that drought? They moved, they left, because they couldn't do what they were doing in their regular agricultural activities during that time frame. So what you're looking at here then is the Barwon Valley was occupied by, the second thing that's taking place then is, of course, the little ice age is kicking in. So what the Tibetan records say, there's famine everywhere on the plateau. People are just, there's just nothing to eat. Well, this begins to then create the context for going to a Bayul. So people are going to the Bayul because of these double factors. They're going because of temperature change, and they're going because of drought. So people are moving into a place that appears to be better, but it might not be. And this is where the archaeology then comes in. So we can begin to think about, what does archaeology tell us then about the way in which the Sherpa actually entered this environment and how they actually thrived or not. The archaeology is really interesting. So what the Sherpa did when they came down into these valleys and said, hey, there's nobody here, let's do something to it. What did they do? They started cutting down the trees because they wanted to increase their pasturage for animals, because they figured this is their basic, survival mechanism. Down lower, you can grow things, but the things they could grow Well, they weren't very adapted to this particular environment. And so they made, a lot of room for their domestic animals. But what happens when you begin to log? And you begin to log in these high elevation environments where there might be increased precipitation, what happens to the soil? It goes away. And so what has taken place then, and the historical records, the archaeology that's been done is pretty clear. Here come the Sherpa, and you can see little bits of change in the, the stratigraphic records of the places that have been sampled by, primarily by, by geologists and plant biologists. But the archaeology kicks in, you begin to see these strata of very significant fire that are taking place that never happened in the valley before at that level. So yeah, these places burn, like many environments do, but not at that rate and not at that, that kind of frequency and not at that intensity. So the Sherpa, they're just busily burning things down because they're expanding their pastures. Well, what does that do? Well, it erodes the soil. And what does that do to a pastoral economy? You have to go someplace else then, or make changes in the way in which the world is working. So I'm not going to talk about what the solution to this was, but the archaeological record is really clear. People moved in because of a climatic shift at the places they used to live. And when they came to a new environment, they massively disrupted that environment for their own subsistence adaptations, not taking into account what those things, of course, would do, because what are they doing? They're living day to day. They're living season to season. And so their changes then really, you can see this is, it looks lovely, but in fact, that's really pretty rough living in that kind of in context with that environment. So the pastoral adaptations then were really marginal in this context. And I'll talk about then what the responses have been in a bit, and when we get to the end of the talk. So that's the Barron Valley, limited archaeological data, but pretty clear climate signals about why people got there and then what happened after they got there. It was not a good thing in terms of the way in which the environment was stewarded and maintained. So the last place we're going to talk about for anybody who's a lover of Europe is the Favreau Valley of High France. I've never been. Only been to the Alps a few times. We've been to other parts of the Alps, but not this particular place. And you can see it's just beautiful. I mean, but what's interesting about this part of the Alps is, I've been looking at environments now. Tiwanaku is at 3,800 to 4,000 meters. The Barron Valley, as I pointed out, is anywhere between. The area that I was speaking of in particular was over 4,000 meters. So we're really way high up. This stuff is, relatively speaking, pretty low. It's a continental mountains and it's only about 1,800 to 2,200 meters of elevation. So we're not way up there. So this is not high altitude adaptation like I study it, but it's high elevation in terms of a continental mountain. And so it looks lovely. I mean, love to go. But this puts it on a landscape just so you know where we're talking about. And so the one that we're interested in is the one to the left, that box there. I will not try to pronounce it because French is not my thing. But you get a sense then that you notice how close we are then to the margins of the Alps themselves. So the lowlands are relatively close there. So you can get a good sense that this is going to be part of the reason why people are here in one sense is that the highlands and lowlands are relatively close to one another. So there's been a good deal of archaeology across all of the Alps in the past. I mean, there's amazing amount of work that's been done. A lot of it's poorly dated. A lot of it's hard to date because there's not much there to date in the first place. And what becomes extraordinary, though, is the complexity of the way in which people have used the Alps over time. So we're going to see a little bit of that right now in this discussion of what climate looked like there. So here's our image again. And, I'm not going to point out any particular one here because what we're going to do in this particular case is that the way in which the archaeologists that worked in this area have talked about this, they're really focusing they focused on climate and their climate work is not what I would call the best, but it's there. And, they need better climatological data. They need better historical, they need more, but let's just work with what we have in this context. So I can't really pinpoint and say, this is the one factor we're going to work on tonight in this particular valley because we don't have enough information. But they have a different take on what's going on here. So you've noticed that, like in the Tiwanaku case, there was this sense that, well, the reason why Tiwanaku collapsed is because of environmental change. Well, these guys are saying, well, no, the reason why things vary in these mountains is not because of climate per se, it's how people perceive the environments and the climate during those time frames. So they're making kind of a cultural argument about the way in which people see the world in different time frames. And they make an argument, they say, look, climate for some of these time periods, it might have been bad, but people seem to accept the risk of working in those places and living in those places, at least to some degree. So this is a bit of a different way of thinking about the way in which people use these mountains. That is, we know, of course, people were making decisions like that in Tiwanaku time, and we know that's in the Barwon Valley. But what you're going to see here tonight is an attempt by the archaeologists to say climate matters, but it doesn't necessarily make that much difference in terms of the way that people are using this particular mountain environment in the French Alps. Okay, let's see. So, I won't go through all the archaeology. There's pretty cool stuff. This is one of the few rock shelters that actually has painted rock. There's a lot of petroglyphs in the French Alps, but if you look really carefully under that overhang, you can see some red pigments up there. These are the first images of animals in the Alps in paint, which is really kind of cool. And there is actually a deposit there that goes into that. Many of the other sites look like this. They're, rock scatters that look like what they are. Maybe a habitation, maybe an enclosure, lots and lots of those across the mountains at different time frames. And you see this in the Barwon Valley, you see this in the other places in the Himalayas, you see this in the high elevation zones in the Andes. What does that signal? Signals animals, it signals pastoralism, but it gets complicated, as you're going to see in a moment. So here's our slide. I want you to keep this one in mind, as we go through what I show you next, because this is really good climate record that speaks very well to this part of Europe. And so it's not too far away in terms of what likely took place in Europe at this time. So keep in mind the medieval warm period, keep in mind the Little Ice Age, and see what happens after that. So this is how the archaeologists then talk about their work. Don't try to read this. That's not what I'm asking you to do. Look at the pretty colors that are coming on here. That's the thing I want you to think about. So Neolithic, Bronze Age, Iron Age, Roman, you've got time frames, right? This is where the sites fit into this. And then there's the way in which they've been dated. And so, okay, fine. And then if you look at those kind of bars that are coming down, that's supposed to be climate deterioration. Forget those bars for a second. To me, they don't make much sense in terms of the way they work because they're really kind of crude. And what I'm going to talk about is slightly crude, but better, I think, in terms of the way I want you to think about this. So let's do this. We don't really know much about the Neolithic. Just forget the Neolithic because there's stuff that's up there. It's just sort of there, and it's not lots of stuff in the lowlands, but almost nothing up there. You see a few things up there, but we can't connect it very clearly to much of anything else going on. It doesn't track a climate signal very well, except a little bit. So forget the Neolithic and don't even worry about the earlier stuff because that's almost non-existent. Things get interesting though in the Bronze Age. Green means, oh, this is nice. This is a good time, and now I'm looking at that temperature record, not the one that you saw there because it goes back further, but according to the way in which climate is being reconstructed, you see that, those are Bronze Age sites that fall into Bronze Age. Keep that in mind as a marker of culture. And it's good, but then take a look at what happens next in terms of Bronze Age. All of a sudden things go wonky. So, but there's still Bronze Age, even though the climate has deteriorated rather significantly in these mountain environments. So there's still people there. And that's really the point of these archaeologists saying, look, climate got bad, but people still use them because they believe that they accepted the risk of living in mountain environments. That's why it's important to think about how that worked. So Bronze Age is kind of weird. And then look what happens in Iron Age and Roman times. There's almost nobody there. Now, the Romans are all over the place in terms of everywhere else in this region, but there's almost no Romans in the mountains. And we know from Roman historical records that they're crossing passes all the time, but they're not staying. This is not part of the Roman model. So is that because of the climate? Not particularly, because the climate actually is really good. This is during the medieval warm period. Very good time to be in Europe if you're living anywhere in Europe, really. But the Romans don't want to be there. which is kind of fun. And so there are many explanations for that, but they're not there. All right, well, let's see what happens in the early medieval period. Things get really busy there. People are doing all sorts of things. And you can see then that it's mostly green, but there's also variability there as well. So some of that is, these are times of, mostly good, but, some bad times in there as well. What are these people doing up there? Well, this is when economics becomes more important than climate in some ways. So in other words, it's not just subsistence adaptations you're looking at here. You're looking at people mining. You're looking at the creation of other kinds of extractive economies in the mountains that are bringing people up and they're coming back down again. So climate in one sense didn't matter to the way in which these particular groups are using these particular mountains, because there were other things they wanted there that were not just pasturing animals at high elevation, which is really what most of the other people have been doing all through this time frame until you get to this point. And what really becomes fun then, as you get down to the last one, there's only a few sites, but the late medieval is right smack in the middle of the Little Ice Age. And although they don't show the sites, this is a time of extraordinary economic expansion in these mountains. People are all over the place. There are villas up there, not nice villas, but there are places where people are living right there that never had lived in these mountains like that before. There are checkpoints. There are places where people are blocking access and egress into these places. So the mountains become extraordinarily far more complex. And it's not so much, again, about climate. In fact, climate is terrible up there. It's really cold and miserable, but yet the mountains are in a hotbed in one sense. They're actually being used by people in a different way. So the argument then is really, in this particular case, that people are ignoring the risk and doing different things in the mountains, regardless of what the climate is, unless they simply are physically unable to do it, which I think is kind of a fun way to look at mountain environments, because it forces you to look at people and what they do, rather than simply look at the archaeology and look at the climate and try to make a funny story up. Think about risk, and risk management is what these archaeologists asked us to do. So those are the three examples I wanted to talk about tonight. And now I want to talk just briefly about, is there anything we can learn from what I've just talked about that makes a difference in terms of certain mountain communities in the world? That is there any lesson to be learned here from this conversation? So let's go here. This is a village that is near some of the archaeological sites I've worked in Nepal. It looks lovely, doesn't it? Samzong village. It's great. It's at 4,000 meters, give or take. It looks so green and so nice. It's really beautiful. It's basically not there anymore. What happened? People there, they left. Climate warming in this region made it impossible for them to stay there. So all that green, there's almost no green left in Samzong right now. And so these are climate refugees, just like the people in Tiwanaku. Climate refugees left Tiwanaku area and tried to find other places to live because they couldn't sustain themselves in that place. And so these people left as well, but the story sounds great. Oh, they lived and they went someplace else. Where did they go? The sad truth of the matter is they went over that mountain into the next valley, and they were given land by the Nepali government and by others who were, being generous about land in one sense. And this is a land, though, that's susceptible to glacial lake outburst floods that have happened repeatedly in this time frame. So this solution here hasn't worked. That is, these people have to move. In fact, I know 3 or 4 or 5 different villages in this part of the Himalayas where people have to move because of water scarcity created by climate change. And the solutions for them are almost non-existent. So, at least the people in Tiwanaku had an option in one sense to go to. They had other ways to, they had other possibilities of creating, different kinds of adaptation to the landscape. These people have not been able to do that. They want to be pastoralists. They want to be farmers. Well, there's no solution for them at this point. So that's a downer of this presentation. It's just not happening for these folks. But, in the Andes, on the other hand, some things actually have worked pretty well. That is, remember those areas that I said, look at the little green areas around Lake Titicaca? That's where the Tiwanaku and others built these remarkable agricultural systems. In Aymara, they're called wadu-wadu. And these are raised fields. And archaeologists have actually done extraordinarily good ethnoarchaeology of building raised fields. And so even even though climate is changing in the Titicaca Basin, the lake is relatively stable, temperatures are, doing okay. And people have started to rebuild these raised field agricultures. And they turn out to be remarkably productive for at least a period of time. But what's the problem with these things? But you can guess what the problem is. Even though this is an adaptation now, an old adaptation to a climate, scenario where you can actually make these things work. There's sufficient water here. Even though the climate is drying, the lake hasn't actually dried up enough yet to make these things infeasible. What's the problem? People don't want to do the labor to make them and maintain them. So it's all about people again. Where do the people go? They go to Lima. They go to Arequipa. They go to big cities because nobody wants to live there anymore. Too much work. I can go to the city and, live in a Pueblo Joven, but, I have opportunities. Here, all I have is, building an agricultural system that nobody really wants, even though they've been constructed by the local people. So here's a climate solution that's working, but it's not got sustainability. So that's another aspect of this whole problem that we deal with, sustainability. So what's going on in the Barron Valley? Well, this is kind of fun. So when you care for glaciers, if you're a Buddhist, you really believe that the way in which you behave in the world actually affects the rate of snowfall and climate change and all these things. So you're really a believer that you are one with the environment, and the environment is dependent on you taking care of it, which is an interesting thing that we don't tend to think of in our own lives. Is that, yeah, we think about the environment, you don't use plastic bags and all that kind of stuff. But these people take it really seriously, that if they don't do the right thing with the environment, then they really will not have sustainable futures in these environments. Well, you can believe that to whatever degree you want. I mean, that's your choice. But what that has meant is, oops, sorry, I can't do this. What that has meant is that there's been a great deal of effort to, in fact, revive the Bayou concept and then engage local authorities to, in fact, make an effort to promote conservation efforts. So in other words, the Sherpa are no longer allowed to go cut things down like they used to. They stop them from doing that. And part of the motivation from doing that is saying, look, you're not caring for the landscape like a good Buddhist would do. And so going back to the Bayou concept of creating this refuge is actually working in the Barron to a point. The government is helping do that by promoting it, but still, you see the message that's being delivered here. It's that we are taking care of the environment, in this particular case through religion, but also government intervention, but we're dealing with the environmental change in a way that seems to be constructive. Is it sustainable? I have no idea. And the reason why I say that is because the Sherpa don't think so either. You know what Sherpas really do for most of their living? They do this. They carry stuff up the hill. And so a lot of Sherpas have out-migrated. So you go to Boulder, lots of Sherpas in Boulder. You go to other places in Europe, lots of Sherpas in, Switzerland. You go to any places in Nepal, lots of Sherpas there because, this is a seasonal environment. That is, you can only climb these high mountains in the spring and in the fall. And what do they do for the rest of the year? Well, they have out-migrated, and they've used they have used this as a means to generate income in terms of, the inability to survive with pastoralism or with agriculture in this region. But is that sustainable? Because what's going to happen to Everest in the next 25 years? What's going to happen to Makalu? Nobody's going to climb them anymore because they'll climb them, but the circumstances of that climbing will be radically different than they are right now. And they have been in the last 50 years. So there's nothing sustainable about this. So it's another downer here. The Barron Valley on the one hand is doing really well, protecting itself, but a lot of the people who live in the Barron Valley are leaving because they can't live there effectively any longer. These are all sad stories in one sense. And I show you this one finally. This is that last one talking about risk. Don't look at the image, just listen for a second. It's really important not to forget that people make decisions about the where they live. And so that last example from the French Alps is really, this is what they're trying to say. People look at the risk, they evaluate the risk, they evaluate the degree to which they will actually be able to sustain the risk or not, and they'll make decisions based on that. Whether they're good or bad decisions is kind of what happens. You just don't know until they get done. So there's no good outcomes of all this, I'm sorry to say. Climate change is really, the insights we have from the past show that people have been able to cope, but there's also interventions that have made it, to make that, there are interventions that could have been done that weren't done. There are interventions that have been made that are not sustainable. And so the problem is, where do we go from here? So, my last image is simply going to be something like this. You remember this slide. I love this slide because it just says everything. This is what's going to be happening in high mountains over the next, 20 years or so. Kind of sad to think about, but every one of these things is going to be the way in which high mountain environments and the people living in are going to have to cope with these. That one in the bottom right is kind of fun, not in a good way. Bugs. When I worked in the Himalayas the very first time, and this is back in 2008 now, no mosquitoes. It was heaven. I could walk up the mountains. I wouldn't be bit by anything, and it was really great. What happens now? Mosquitoes have already migrated to 3,500 meters and they're going higher. And so people that, one of my poor colleagues is allergic to mosquito bites. So she gets these gigantic welts. And so it's like, but they carry disease. And we know from the past that people from the lowlands were down there. They went down to the lowlands where malaria and other diseases were common. They came back up and died in their homelands because we've got the ancient DNA and the human remains to prove that. So this is only going to get worse in every single mountain environment you can think of. This is what's going to be happening to those places. Sorry. But in any case, thank you. This is all the people who gave me money to do all this work and all these things that have been fun to talk about tonight. And thank you for OKPAN for inviting me to, give a discussion about some of the things that I think are important for thinking about our future as well as our past. And I've also been asked then to put this slide up on as well. So if you want to, this slide will be online someplace, and if you want to take a picture of it anytime you want, please do. Anyway, thank you for your attention tonight. I appreciate you. We probably have a few minutes for questions. So if you have anything you want to know about that I can answer, even if I can, I'll answer it. I'll give you an answer. Yes.
I was thinking about your idea about how people live with landscapes, and live with climate change. And I think about like the East Coast of the United States, where houses get destroyed by hurricanes and then they just get rebuilt. They get destroyed by hurricanes and they just get rebuilt, right? This is true in the Caribbean, this is true in other places, and maybe these things are happening on a scale that's hard to, to find archaeological. We don't have that resolution necessarily to see that. But on the long term, they are still going to abandon those landscapes. They're going to move away from those landscapes.
Yeah.
And so I feel like, some of the things that we talk about when we think about environmental collapse or something like that, these things are not happening on a scale that's easily, the resolution just isn't there really to see a lot of it. And things happen very slowly and gradually before it finally reaches a point where that, people just kind of finally give up and say, that's it. We built a house 5 times, we're done.
Right.
Away.
But see, those people are stupid. The ones we're talking, no, seriously, those people just don't get it because they own that land and there's no way for them to ever recoup their economic, investment in it. When I'm talking about the, campesino or, someone in the Himalayas, their options are remarkably limited because the only thing they have is land. And if they have no land that they can actually farm, what happens then? So we've talked about like that village I showed you the picture of. We talked, the Swiss came in and said, well, if you do this and this and this and this, it'll fix all these things up. And of course it didn't. It didn't make any difference in terms of water availability because the climate is just not making it possible for them to do anything else but leave. And unfortunately, they left to a bad place. But I think, your point is well taken. A lot of economic decisions that we make are not rational. A lot of these folks are making decisions where they have their decisions under constraint and they don't have options that many people have to really then sustain, livelihoods in these places. So what do you do? I mean, there is no way these people are going to make a living up there in the next 25 years. It's just not going to happen. So what happens to Kathmandu? It's already overpopulated by way too many people. What happens to the folks that are there now? It's a mess. more downer. Really not good. No, no message of hope here, I'm sorry. Yes, please.
You were talking about in South America where they made these raised beds, raised gardens, and then that was actually working, but people didn't want to do the work.
Mhm.
But that was actually, in the long term, wouldn't that have been more sustainable than moving to town and then the government shuts down and there's no food?
Well, that's kind of what Tom's point is that people make these short-term, they make these decisions and don't think about the long-term consequences necessarily of the way they do things. So they figure, well, they see a TV, you're in Catavaya and you're watching TV and go, man, Lima looks really good to me. And what am I doing here? I get up every morning at dawn, I go out and break my back, digging a canal, and I come home and, that's what I have. This is my life. And so people move, they leave because they think there's opportunity. And of course, in many cases, there's not. For these climate migrants, it's really tough because, most of the places they go are already overpopulated and already stressed by whatever stresses are taking place in those regions. And it's just, the solutions are really very poor for them. So the raised fields, they work as long as two things, as long as there's enough water and there's enough labor. If these climate scenarios continue, the Andes are going to begin to dry more significantly. That's going to drop the lake level of Lake Titicaca. And what that means is these will become unsustainable in the long run because of the way climate is changing. So, how fast will it happen becomes the question. We don't know that yet. Okay, everybody seems to be tired. I appreciate your time and, listening to me. And so think about climate change. And if you go to mountains, think about the people who live there and, the ones that they deal with that every day of their lives. And so it's tough, believe me. Okay, thanks. Oh, one more.
Can I just?
Of course.
Attempt one question. People here from, we're here on the university campus. People here, we tend to think that we do science and we try to find solutions to challenges like these. What kind of level you see in this long term of knowledge that helps to make decisions on terms of moving groups of people to different places in certain period of time? As you pointed out, in the highlands, this raised bed agriculture is one solution that done and worked well for a long time for folks in Altiplano. There are also terraces in the hillsides all over the place, right? Where most of them abandoned now.
Right.
But I see colleagues, scientists who go and try to research and multidisciplinary teams and more talk about traditional knowledge.
Yes.
How people have been adapting in the millennia to change this level. What do you see any signs of that in particular cases?
I do, and I see that really clearly in the Andes. And I was going to include a slide on that tonight, but I decided not to. There's been a very significant attempt across many of the Andean, high mountain environments to recreate what they are calling, the Inca way of doing agricultural production, which is a really complex way of using water and planting and doing a variety of things. And it's been state directed to some extent. NGOs have been involved as well, creating these things. So on the one hand, it sounds like this could work. But there's another thing I want you to keep in mind that, I learned about through, the kind of the question you asked, but I came at it a different way. There's people are very prone to what's called path dependence. So in other words, what I used to do 100 years ago is what I'm still doing today. And they don't think about they don't think about beyond the long term. They just say, well, we've been doing it this way. And so there's a path that's been created. And people often are very reluctant to move out of that path. So on the one hand, going back to what an Inca might have done, let's say, 800 years ago, sounds great, but it's a path that didn't work in some context in the Inca world. And so is it likely that that path is not going to be productive. And so I see two sides of that issue. On the one hand, yeah, let's reinvent some of these agricultural technologies. On the other hand, I worry about their sustainability, given the way the modern world works and given the way that many of these things really talk about need lots of human bodies to do the work, labor. I mean, do you want to do that? No, I don't want to do that, but so many people don't either. And so it's one thing to talk about reconstructing environments, and it's another then to think, well, are there going to be enough, is there enough labor, and will the environment then actually sustain these transformations? As we know, it's changing dramatically in terms of rainfall, in terms of, snow melt, and all the things that I showed in that slide. We know that's going to happen. Will they make any difference? And I'm not so sure. So I take your point that, you have to look at both sides of that equation. Mhm.
I have another question
Sure.
on this climate change thing. So some places are going to have less rain, but other places are gonna have more.
Mhm.
And from everything that I've seen, we don't know which places are gonna have more, which are gonna have, I mean, we know we can see some places are definitely having more droughts. So, I don't know.
It's so complicated because, it might be the same amount of rain, but it all comes in 2 days. Or it might be, instead of being snow, it comes at rain at the wrong time. So that the rain doesn't change, but the climate, the weather changes it so that the water is completely unusable. It collapses your roof, it washes away, your plants, what you've just planted. So the problem is it's hard, and in mountains, it's really much more difficult because remember, all those different orographies of mountains and the way in which they're situated make predicting any particular local place really hard. We just know that the big picture of high mountains is going to be, decreased precipitation or, asynchronous precipitation when you really don't need it, or different form of precipitation, or just no precipitation. So, we can look at the big picture, but everything gets local when you're the poor farmer trying to figure out how to make a living. But I like your question because, yeah, we do know that some parts of the world are going to get lots more, but there are places that are already getting a lot of rainfall and they're going to get more. And what is that going to do for them? Things are only going to be more difficult even in those places. It's a mess.
It's hard to plan a strategy when you don't really know. what's
Exactly.
happening.
All we know is that, we've already passed the, 1.5 climate, number. And it's really kind of rocketing, rocketing this way toward increasing more rapidly. And we know the changes are going to take place more rapidly than we anticipate. And the climate models, they're getting better, but again, it's all about local. If you want to tell a farmer in Samsung what his life is going to be like in 5 years, that climate model won't be very helpful to you. Yeah.
So you proposing that maybe instead of besides studying climate change, emphasizing also in sustainability.
Yeah.
Yeah, so to find like suitable solutions that can be applied, that people apply in the past that may be applied in the future.
Yep. But I always get really hung up on that word, sustainability, because, it's a really easy word to say, oh, this is a sustainable approach to X. And then you always ask the question, sustainable in what context, for how long, to what end? And that's when the sustainability idea gets really kind of, it doesn't help any longer. So I think that's one of the dangers of saying, let's go back to what the Inca or the, middle formative or whatever people were doing, because it worked for a while then. These things look like they're great. But, we know that they also fell apart at some stage too. So they weren't sustainable given what we know about then. And certainly we know enough that some of these technologies aren't going to work, like springs. They're going to dry up at some point for a variety of reasons. We just know that. They're going to go away. And so if you base an agricultural system on, spring-fed agriculture in a high mountain environment, you can almost guarantee two things. One, there's going to be an earthquake at some point in many of these places that makes the spring retract, the spring retract, and then any irrigation system based on it is going to be stranded. That happens so often in the Himalayas where, you see these great agricultural fields, and here's a spring that now is down here, and the fields are up here. It's like, oops. So they're sustainable for periods, maybe.
I have a question about the community that relocated or essentially
Mm.
relocated.
It did.
So that relocation, was that based on, were there social connections? Was that a political, was that a government process?
So this is a great site, these little big, sorry, they all gotta go away here. Okay, so, when I started working there, now almost, 2008 was when I first visited there. This is what the community looked like. It was, it looked like it was thriving. But every time you talk to somebody, they said, well, there's just not enough water. And if you go a little bit further upstream and you go a bit further downstream, you can see all the abandoned fields that are there. Now, the question is, why did they get abandoned? Is it because there's not enough water? Or is it because there's not enough people to make the fields work? And so I think it's both of those things at that point. So that's one thing that happened here. So were there social connections? No. The government and a Swiss foundation got together and offered land on the other side of this mountain to have these people rebuild their lives in one sense. But, you look at these, I mean, they could not rebuild like this. They built, kind of little rectangles, where are their animals going to go in this new place? They can't, there's no place for their animals to go. So they come back over the mountain and, do their animals. Sometimes they even grow some of the stuff in these fields. So it was a solution that there was no other alternative for these folks. They could go move someplace like to a city down lower. They could go to Kathmandu. Nobody wanted to do that. Some of them did, actually, they go. So it was just an imposed solution that doesn't really work for anybody. So they are actually seen as interlopers on land. And what's the downside? So there's still glacial lakes up above them. The land that they got, great. It's land that actually had been savaged by a glacial lake outburst, maybe 10 years ago. And it's basically unusable. I mean, their boulder is half the size of this room that are on this new land that these guys got. So no good solution, unfortunately, for them. Does anybody want to ask a question? It's an up point question, right? I'm sorry, Tom?
I said, if you like the sound of that, I got some swamp planters.
Yeah, really. I mean, they're grateful to have some place new to live, but there's nothing for them there. They can't do what they're doing here. So their path dependence got in the way. That is, this is what we've always done. We can't, but what are we going to do now? There's no way to fix it for them in many ways. So have you ever bought sweaters from the Himalayas, from someplace? These people actually make sweaters that they sell in India and then they get sold abroad. Kind of cool. I don't have one. They're not that great, but anyway, that's an alternative. That's an outlet for some of them to actually then find a way to create an economy for them to, persist, but it's hard.
I think we could see in the path thing right now here in America. Certain farmers been growing this crop forever, and that's what they've always done. And even though they're running out of water, they can't see themselves doing anything else, and that's a big problem.
That's right. My daddy did it this way. Cattle is really a big one on this one. My family's ranched this place for, I don't know. Did you ever see that? I didn't. I only watched one episode and got really pissed off at it. The episode of Yellowstone.
Yeah.
Oh man, the first episode is really, it's like, I am not going to watch this show anymore because these people are just, they're not bad. And the guy was saying, I got a spread here that's the size of Rhode Island. It's like, man, that is just wrong, because all they're doing is growing cattle on someplace that's really, it's sustainable until people stop buying meat, until it becomes difficult in the Rocky Mountain environments to keep these things going. So yeah, path dependence is a real big problem, I think, for many communities. They don't see options and they don't know what else to do about it. Yeah.
You talk about with like the caring for the glaciers and the bio route, and how one of those is like trying to stop chippers from like deforesting currently.
Right.
Is it more of like a kind of mostly like more of a spiritual kind of thing, or are there more kind of other material like impacts of this kind of thing?
There's both. It's kind of interesting to see. Most of it is an attitude for the environment. So you really, you're saying if I don't do the right rituals, which, you can decide whether or not they're efficacious or not. If I don't do these properly and we don't do them at the right frequency, then the mountains are going to be angry and, the snow cap will disappear and then we won't have snow melt. Okay, you can take that for what that's worth. But people actually then intervene in some of these contexts as well. So that, for instance, when, that Caring for Glaciers book that I showed you, some people in Ladakh actually go to the mountains and they put charcoal on the mountain sides, as much as they can, because what does that do? The charcoal actually then promotes melting of the snow so that they get more snow melt at the right time. So they're doing a caring for the mountain by not just a ritual event, but actually then creating a context for the mountain to give them what they need. So there's a little bit of both. I mean, you really can't do, that's not a sustainable strategy. How much charcoal do you need to make it, all this work on a glacier? Well, some, but not very much. So it's a combination of things because most of these folks, again, they have such limited options, have so few options that these things are both comfort and practice for them as well.
We're gonna let this man go home.
Okay, you guys are all done now. Hey, thanks again for all your comments and questions. It's not as bad as you think, but it's not good either, so.
No, that's still not. It's really,
Okay.
as much as I can.
I'll just pull my.
Yeah, go
It won't change.
Yeah.
Okay.